Everything's down here except the controller. No, it's not in the box. Got it.
There you go. Should be good.
All right. Well, it's about time for us to get started. I hope a lot of people are probably going to come drifting in. Eastbound I-40 is just about at a standstill, so we left early anticipating it. Jerry? All right. Well, for those of you, I think there are a few people in here that have not been in this class up until this point. This has been a two-quarter series where we've been talking about how we got from verbal scripture to manuscript scripture to bound scripture, which eventually led us to the Bibles that we have today, the versions that we have today. So we've gone through a lot of material that I'll not go back over again, but I will kind of review last week just a little bit. Here we go again. Now take it back one, please. Take it back to the second, or the... Let me see if I can take it back. Okay, there we go. Now, okay, so as of last week's lesson, this little chart back here behind me kind of incorporates the material we went over for a week or so in previous lessons. And we talked about John Wycliffe and how he was the first person to translate a Bible that just put it all together kind of into one big Bible. The problem with John Wycliffe was that he translated it out of the Latin Vulgate. Okay, he did not go back to the original Greek manuscripts. And then years went by, and then this fellow named Tyndall, William Tyndall, came along. And he studied at Oxford University under a guy named Erasmus. Now, if y'all think back to way back earlier in the series, we talked about Erasmus, that he was this brilliant Greek scholar, and he took all of the Greek texts he could get his hands on, and he put together a Greek text of the Bible, at least of the New Testament anyway, that became known eventually as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. It sort of took on this aura about it that it didn't matter who else had translated something out of, into the Greek. As far as the Bible went, his just stood head and shoulders above everyone else. And for a couple of centuries, the Textus Receptus was viewed that way. But Tyndall came along in 1534, and he studied at Oxford under Erasmus. Erasmus was his Greek teacher. And he set about his life's work to translate the Bible out of the original languages, the whole Bible, okay? So we studied about how he came up with his Bible and was burned at the stake for it by the Roman Catholic Church. And then the Coverdale Bible, a friend of his, created this revision of the work that Tyndall had done, and it became known as the Coverdale Bible. And he used the source material from Tyndall's work for that Bible. And then in 1537, we had the Matthew's Bible that was created. A guy named Rogers, John Rogers, I think was his name, worked under a pseudonym or a fake name and published this Matthew's Bible, but he was eventually hunted down and burned at the stake also. But anyway, he created this Bible called the Matthew's Bible, and from it, a guy named Taverner took the Matthew's Bible and wrote his Bible as a revision of the Matthew's Bible. But it was not very well or widely received. So then in 1539, the King of England decided that they wanted to create a standard version of the Bible that was going to be placed in all the churches in England. So they took the work that had been done by the Matthews Bible and they just revised it, okay, and they created this big chunky Bible that was placed. It was called the Great Bible for several reasons. One was that it was authorized by the king to be placed in the churches, but the other was that it was a great big large format Bible, okay. So this 1539 Great Bible came into use and was distributed through all the churches. And then between 1539 and 1560, a change of monarchs in England led to Bloody Mary, Mary Tudor, coming into power, and she was an ardent Roman Catholic, and it was said about trying to turn England back to Roman Catholicism. At this point, it was primarily Protestant, okay? So a bunch of scholars and teachers and church clergy and so forth that were being persecuted, some 300 of them were burned at the stake, okay, and another 100 or so died in prisons under Mary Tudor. But they fled from England, a bunch of them, and went over to Switzerland, where the Swiss Reformed movement was going on. And they put together this Bible called the Geneva Bible, extremely popular Bible. It competed with the King James head-to-head for years and years as far as sales go. It was a well-constructed revision, or edition, I should say, of the Bible, and it hung on for a very long time. But then the problem with it was that it was created over under the influence of John Calvin in Switzerland. And at that point, John Calvin was pushing all this stuff that we see in Presbyterianism today as predestination. And so they had put a bunch of margin notes into the text that showed that viewpoint. And of course, the Anglicans couldn't stand that, so they went about creating their own Bible. So they created the Bishop's Bible. And the Bishop's Bible was a revision of the Great Bible with the specific intent to take all that Calvinistic margin notes and stuff out of it. So they went back to the Great Bible and used that text to create the Bishop's Bible. Ignore the broken line. It should be hooked to the Bishop's Bible. And the Bishop's Bible and the Geneva Bible were the two, and the Tyndale Bible, all three of those sources, were the primary feedstock for the King James Version when it was created in 1611. So the men that were translating the King James were specifically told that they were not to create a new Bible from scratch, that they were to use the text primarily of the Bishop's Bible and revise it. So they took the best work that they could find from Tyndale, the best stuff they could get out of the Geneva Bible, and the bulk of the text out of the Bishop's Bible, and went about looking at other sources to come up with the King James Version, or the authorized version. This had put a lot of pressure on the Roman Catholic Church because they were losing their audience in England, and so they set about creating their own Bible in English, which is just amazing to me. They burned hundreds of people at the stake who wanted to create an English translation so that the English people could read the Bible in their own language. And now all of a sudden they've had a change of heart and they go about and create their own English translation. So this Douay-Rheims Bible, we talked about that last week. Its primary source was the Latin Vulgate, but it did refer to the work that had been done with the King James Bible because of the beauty, the stylistic beauty of the language. So that's where the Douay-Rheims Bible came from. Now, I did a real quick review to catch some folks up that hadn't been in here before. Any questions before I go further? Okay. So we're going to talk about the King James primarily tonight. Next week, I'm going to be down at the Cancer Center in Nashville, and John Lewis will be picking up with several versions of the Bible that were created after the King James. We're going to talk about the King James and why it was that it didn't just become the Bible that we would still have today, unchanged. Okay? So I had a question from someone in the audience last week wanting to know what texts did they use for the King James Bible when they were doing this translation. And by that I mean like Greek texts or Hebrew texts. So this first line I've got on here, Erasmus, his Textus Receptus was the primary document that was used for the Greek that was translated in the New Testament portion of the King James Bible. It was not the only Greek. They did have other Greek manuscripts, but the problem with all of this material they were working with when they were translating the King James, none of the big magnificent finds of the 1800s and the 1700s had been made yet. They didn't have the Sinaiticus text and the Vaticanus and so forth. So what they were dealing with was a bunch of very late copies out of the Middle Ages. So these are copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. And they carried forward some kind of odd renderings of the Greek that these much older texts that we found later, after the King James had already been written, straightened out. But the Textus Receptus was what they used on the New Testament portion, and then the Masoretic text was for the Hebrew translation. And if you all remember, in the Hebrew nation, there were these people called the Masoretes who carried on the scribal tradition of counting the numbers of vowels and the numbers of sentences, and they had a numeric system all worked out to where they kept up stringently with their copies of the Hebrew text. Okay? And the Bible that they came up with that had been passed forward through time was called the Masoretic text. And then the Septuagint Greek text, that is the translation of the Hebrew Bible that was made prior to Christ. And Jesus quoted the Septuagint all through his ministry. Okay? And it was a Greek translation of the Hebrew text. But the Septuagint and the Latin Vulgate were the two main documents that they referenced for translating the apocryphal sections of the Bible. And you say, well, what does the Apocrypha have to do with the King James? Well, it had a lot to do with the King James for about the first 10 revisions of it. So we'll look at that here in just a moment. But the problem was that all of these manuscripts that they were using, they were the best that they had available at the time, but they were all nowhere near as accurate as the Sinaitic and Alexandrian and Vaticanus texts that we have for translation purposes today, because they hadn't even been made public or found yet. So, what's the problem with the King James, and why has it led to multiple revisions down through the years? Well, one problem is that it contains many archaic words and expressions that nobody uses anymore or understands. And in some cases, the meanings of some of the words, it took on a completely new meaning over the century or two, following its initial writing. It also has some just pretty straightforward errors of translation, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But examples like in Mark 6:20 and 1 Thessalonians 5:22, but we'll talk about that more here in a little bit. And then on top of all of that, aside from the translational errors and the faulty text that they were translating from, they had a lot of printing errors. Some of these printing errors are just blow your mind when we look at them here in just a moment. And some of these printing errors got carried forward from edition to edition for quite a while before they got straightened out. So let's look at some examples of the antiquated wording or phrasing. Here in Genesis 25:29, it says, "And Jacob sod pottage." Do any of you know what sod pottage means? The only way you've probably known is some Bible teacher's gone into a Bible dictionary and looked it up or compared it to a modern translation and told you that he prepared this bean soup, this lentil soup that he was making. But sod pottage, okay, that's an example of these archaic expressions. It says in Exodus 19:18, and Mount Sinai was altogether on a smoke. Strange phrasing. I mean, a lot of us, I grew up on the King James, okay? So I had teachers that would explain these oddities in the translation as we would go along. But if you were a young person, like some of these young folks sitting back here toward the back, and you read this, I can just see the look on your face. Sod pottage? The mountain was on a smoke? It didn't make any sense to them, okay? And the whole purpose of doing an English translation is to get it into the vernacular of the people who are trying to read it to where they can understand it. And here, Job 26:5, "Dead things are formed from under the waters, and the inhabitants thereof." Strange. Okay, you'd have to go to a Bible dictionary and look at that verse and try to figure out what it means. Or Psalms 5 and 6, "Thou shalt destroy them that speak leasing." Have you ever heard someone speak leasing? See, it's another one of those phrases that just, as time went on, it's like anything else. The English language has changed a lot since the 1700s. It has changed a lot. Now, you crank several hundred more years back into the past onto that, and you see this kind of problem, is that the King James used a very old version of English, a very medieval version of the English language at the time that it was written. Yes? That's exactly what we're going to talk about. You wanted to know when these got corrected, okay? So let's read this last two here. "For who can eat, or who else can hasten hereunto more than I?" Well, I've read a lot of Shakespeare, so I could understand that. But there's some really odd ones, like in Luke 17:9, "I trow not." I trow not? I don't think anybody in here that's not an expert in medieval English would be able to understand these things. They did in 1611. But what about in 1711? Yes. He said they understood these words at the time that the book was written. And that's absolutely correct. They understood all these odd expressions. I had to go to a medieval dictionary as I was trying to figure out what some of these phrases said, okay? And you can get to one online. Some universities have these medieval dictionaries that you can use. So let's look at some more here. So here's some words. This is just a whole collection of words that were in the 1611 translation. And I went to that medieval dictionary and I tried to figure out as many of them as I could. But we don't use words any longer like almug, you know, if we're talking about sandalwood, or chode. I've never been called a chode before, but I'm sure someone thought that. A stupid or unpleasant person. Or going on down in here, we can just pick one. A cab? What's a cab? Well, it turns out it's a wooden sandal that they used to wear. Or neist. It means to sneeze. I mean, this goes on and on. Some of these, like ring-sacked, I never could find a translation for that. Or a strake. If you were wearing a piece of clothing that had a decorated band that went around it, That would be called a strake in 1611. Okay. Let's see here. Sod. I finally did find sod, and it means to heat or boil something liquid. When it talked about him sodding pottage, he sod pottage. But the thing is that most of these words very rapidly fell out of usage. And so by the time the first edition of the 1611 King James was published, it was already going out of date because the English language was changing very rapidly, just like it's changing very rapidly today. I mean, I can think of probably 8 or 10 different words today that have an utterly, completely different meaning than they did, let's say, 100 years ago. Cool, right? Gay. Yeah. I mean, we could go on and on with these words that over time, their meaning changes. Yes, John?
This is shortly after the time of Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Those of you who suffered through Shakespeare in school and know the language that was spoken at that time. It also was a time in which a decision was made for English. English would be a very dynamic language. English shamelessly borrows from other languages.
Yes, it does.
Unlike French, where they have a commission that ensures purity of language, and so the French have a French word instead of hamburger and other things like that, so that maintain purity of the French language. So English is a very dynamic language that changes rapidly, and it started at this period of time.
Yeah. Did you hear what John said? John was saying that the English language is very dynamic, and it borrows from numerous foreign languages, French and Spanish and on, and that unlike the French language today, where if they're going to introduce a new word into the written material in France, they have a commission that has to approve the use of the word because they're trying to maintain the purity of the French language. We don't have anything like that here. Here it's wide open, baby. I mean, just whatever people want to come up with. If you get enough people using it, it just becomes ingrained in the popular vernacular. But these were all words that, with at least 100 years of the 1611, began to have people calling very loudly for a new translation. So let's talk about something else here, the Apocrypha. And then, we had a whole lesson on the Apocrypha. And as it works out, the clergy in the English church, the Anglicans, they wanted to maintain the apocryphal books in the translation. The problem was they had this huge population of Puritans at this point in Scotland and in England both that said that the Apocrypha has no business being included in the text. I mean, put it as a separate section or something, but just separate it out from the approved biblical text. And this was an issue that kind of came to a boil until this Archbishop Abbot in 1616 finally put out a decree and said, if anyone publishes anything, any translation or edition or revision of the King James Bible that does not have, of the authorized version, that does not include the Apocrypha, we're going to put you in prison for a year. So he thought he had settled the issue, but of course he did not. But they did pretty consistently continue to put the Apocrypha in all of these additional editions and revisions all the way up until about 1826. So at that time, this British Foreign Society, who were sending missionaries and so forth and Bibles all over the place, decided they were going to just omit it from their version of the Bible that they were putting out. So that kind of marked a turning point where you have a King James edition being produced in, 1826 that did not include the Apocrypha. So I mean, they did it for several reasons. The primary one was they just didn't have enough money to publish those extra words in the text, so they abandoned it. But it had been an issue for quite some time. Okay, so I want to show you, you really get into some weird stuff. The initial printing of the King James Bible, they wanted 20,000 copies. They thought that would be enough copies to, displace the Great Bible in all of its distribution. And so they didn't have a printing house that could print that much material fast enough. So they divided the work up between printers. Well, these printers made some errors, separate and apart from one another, different errors. And so they ended up producing these two, particularly over a translation of Ruth 3 and 15, verse 15, where you had two different Bibles that came out. One was referred to as the Great He Bible, and the other one was called the Great She Bible. And it was all over this translation of this verse. So the He Bible in that verse reads, "He," that is Boaz, "measured 6 measures of barley and laid it on her, and he," that is Boaz, "went into the city." That's the way the one printer did it, okay? The other printer translated it, and instead of saying, "and he, Boaz, went into the city," it said, "and she, Ruth, went into the city." So you ended up with these Bibles with these monikers hung on them of the King James, and then they had other errors in them also, like in Matthew 26 and 36 in the He Bible. They mistakenly, the printer, when he was typesetting, set it up to where it says, "Then cometh Judas," instead of "Then cometh Jesus." A little bit of an error there. And then the She Bible, on the other hand, they had a whole succession of words that were double printed, particularly back in Exodus around 20 and 24. And then they had an error in Matthew 23:24 that, oddly enough, kept being copied over and over and over again in subsequent editions, practically all the way up till the present time before it finally got straightened out. But it talks about in Matthew 23 and 24, instead of saying strain, it said strain at a gnat instead of strain out a gnat. Okay, so I mean, it's a lot of these little subtle mistakes and so forth that you get into when you're looking at these printers, because remember, back in that day, they didn't sit down, print this stuff up on their computer, present it to an editor, who would proofread it and sign off on it. You had a bunch of guys that, some of them had more and some of them had less education, that were typesetting one letter at a time, one block at a time, putting these sheets together to be printed. So you could get into some really strange things with these editions. So someone asked, well, when did they finally get around to straightening this stuff out? Well, the problem is they might have straightened that out, but they injected other errors in as you went from edition to edition down through the years. In 1631, they had this edition of the King James that came out that was referred to by the common folks as the Wicked Bible. And the reason they called it that was because it lacked the word "not" in the 7th commandment. So it read, "Thou shalt commit adultery," instead of "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Needless to say, the king's printers were severely fined by the archbishop for such an error as that. And then in 1653, you have another edition, another printing, and it contained an error in 1 Corinthians 6:9 that reads, "The unrighteous shall inherit the earth," instead of "the righteous." Okay. And then in 1702, you have an edition that came out called the Scribe's Bible, and it says, "Printers have persecuted me," in Psalm 119, 161, instead of saying "princes had persecuted me." So you get into these errors that keep getting injected back into the text and then corrected in a subsequent edition, and then the subsequent edition will have another error that it throws into the mix. So in 1717, you had a an edited version of the King James that came out that people referred to as the Vinegar Bible. Well, why is that? Well, this edition had lots of misprints, but the one that gave it its name, it comes out of Luke 23, where the title for the chapter, instead of saying the parable of the vineyard, it says the parable of the vinegar. So it became known as the Vinegar Bible. And then in 1795, we're getting closer and closer here, an edition came out of the King James where they were trying to revise all the previous errors, and they made their own mistake. So in Mark 7:27, it reads, "Let the little children first be killed," instead of "be filled." And then in 1805, you have a Bible, a King James, that was revised and published by Cambridge University Press, and they had had a proofreader work on this one to try to straighten this stuff out. And he had come down through the text, and at one point in Galatians 4:29, he had put a note in there. It says, "to remain." In other words, don't take this out, right? But the printer, when he set the type up, he included it in the text. And so it made Galatians 4:29 read, "Him that was born after the Spirit to remain." And oddly enough, the same mistake was reprinted twice more in 1806 and again in an 1819 edition. So, some attempts were called for to try to straighten the mess out. Okay, and one of the original people that when the very first 1611 text came out, he was a very early critic and said, "Look, this translation is full of errors that need to be fixed before you take this thing to publication." Well, he wasn't listened to, and they went ahead and took it to press. But he had pointed out enough very significant translation errors that it did finally push things to a revision in 1629 and then a second revision in 1638 as they're trying to scrub the text and get these errors worked out of it. The 1638 revision continued to be used all the way up until about 1724, okay, in a lot of the texts. And this fellow named Edward Wells came out with his translation in an attempt to clean the text up, and he called it the Common Translation Corrected. Well, he didn't quite correct all of it. So in 1729, a guy named Daniel Mace came out and he says, "Well, I'm going to make a 2-column Bible. On the left-hand side is going to be the authorized version text, and in the column right next to it, we're going to put the Greek text. And maybe that'll help straighten this out." So he put that out in 1729. But in 1768, John Wesley, who formed the Methodist Church, okay, he was an Anglican from his birth to his death, but his followers formed the Methodist Church. But he came out and produced a revised King James, and he said he titled his "The New Testament with Notes for Plain, Unlettered Men Who Know Only Their Mother Tongue." So again, he's putting his input into this, trying to straighten the text out and get all these goofy errors out of it and get a clean text. And then in 1769, this guy named Dr. Benjamin Blaney, he was the Regius Professor of Hebrew at Oxford University in England. He revised the King James and published it, and it was called the Oxford Standard Edition. And that publication had a lot of weight associated with it. Okay, Oxford was a tower of scholarly learning, and it hung around for a long time. It was way up into the 1800s before calls for a new translation began to be tossed out there. And why is that? If we go back in our own experience and read our own documents, just in America, if you ever tried to go back and read an old will from the 1760s or 50s or whatever, it really strains at your ability to sort out and figure out what in the world these people were talking about. That's exactly the same problem that all of these people were having with the King James down through the years, is that the language was archaic. The document base that it was translated out of was the best that they had at the time, but it could have been a whole lot better. And a lot of the people doing the translation did not have the depth of scholarly knowledge of the languages that they were trying to translate out of to really do the kind of in-depth job that they needed to do. So I was going to read you a quote that I thought kind of hit the nail on the head. This is out of The Journey from Text to Translations by Paul Wegner. On that very opening screen, I've got the ISBN number and all that for this book, for any of y'all that want to get one. But it says, by the early 1800s, people became increasingly dissatisfied with the authorized edition for reasons delineated by Herbert March, the Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity at Cambridge, and later the Bishop of Peterborough. And this is what he had to say that I think kind of sums up what the issue was, and what the same issue we're going to face in another 100 years with our ESVs and our NIVs and whatever it is you're reading. The language will have continued to change. The document base that we have for doing the translation will have changed just like it did on these folks. Because remember, it was back in the 1800s and the late 1700s when all these new documents were showing up. They were digging them up out of the sand. They were finding them in old libraries and so forth. Documents that predated anything that they had to translate out of for the King James by, many centuries. So this professor says, it's probable that our authorized version is as faithful a representation of the original scriptures as could have been formed at that time. Okay? But when we consider the immersed accession that has been made both to our critical and philological apparatus, when we consider the most important sources of intelligence for the interpretation of the original scriptures, were likewise opened after that period. And here he's referring to those big three documents that we've talked about earlier in this course. We cannot possibly pretend that our authorized version does not require amendment. So this, we've worked our way up into the early 1800s, and people are finally kind of throwing their hands up and saying, look, the whole translational basis for the King James Version was on these very late manuscripts. And now we've discovered all these new documents, and it's time for a change. And the Textus Receptus, for instance, that Erasmus had provided, that they used for the Greek portion of the translation, it was made out of medieval Greek texts. Okay, so it had been considered the gold standard for Greek translation until they began to find these massive whole Bible Greek texts that dated way back. And so the Westcott, Hort Westcott, yeah, thank you. I drew a mental blank on the guy's name. When they got together and did their translation out of the Greek text, it has become the standard Greek translation now. And so
they went not all of those things to a good Greek text, not a translation.
Right. What he's saying is that the difference is that Horton Westcott had access to these extremely old Greek texts, which the King James translators did not have access to. And so when they did their work, it kind of updated our whole knowledge base for the Greek language. And so today's Bibles are not based on the same documents that were used for the King James translation. but rather on much older documents dating all the way back to like the 2nd or 3rd or 4th century. Okay, whereas these documents are way up. Some of them were copies made as late as the 1300s or 1400s. Is someone giving me the... Yes.
David, this is just an overall comment. I have this about every one of your lessons, which are fantastic, as I told you. But I am going to believe that there's never been one of these translations that you've talked about that would have prevented a person from becoming a Christian.
Did y'all hear what he said?
God is, he created man, and he knew all of this stuff was going to happen.
Yep.
He knew these mistakes were going to happen,
Yeah.
I absolutely believe that there's going to always be the truth.
Yeah. Okay, well, don't misunderstand me. He's saying that he believes that all these translations and all these additions and revisions, that you could learn how to become a Christian by reading one of them. And I absolutely agree with him. What I'm trying to establish the basis in your mind for is that there's going to come a time when these modern translations that we have our hands on today are going to become outdated. They're going to become antiquated, just like the King James did. The language will have progressed and so forth, but the text doesn't change. It just needs to be revised into the language of the people of the time, okay? But I absolutely agree with you that any of these Bibles, through all these revisions and additions down through the centuries, could have brought a person to a belief in Jesus Christ, a saving belief in Jesus Christ.
There's a big difference between a glaring, blatant error and change of vernacular definition. Now, some of those errors that you cited,
Right.
they were pretty bad. As far as errors go,
Yeah, yeah.
sod pottage, nobody says that now.
Right. Well, I think the places where you can get into some dangerous territory is when a translator comes with the belief that all you have to do, for instance, is say a prayer to be saved. He might minimize the use of the term baptism, for instance, or someone that is really hammering on the point about baptism might try to minimize faith. What we need to do is get our personal opinions out of it and translate the text and let God do with His Word what needs to be done as people read it.
Some of that stuff in there, some of those errors, they would have been fought for the enemies of the
Yes.
They were just blasted.
I have to wonder if the printer was sober at the time that he did some of those errors. But okay, well, I will be at Vanderbilt next Wednesday and Thursday, and anyway. So John Lewis is going to take up with the very next translation, which is the Revised Version, and you're going to go through, what, about 4 or 5 translations? Approaching more of the modern period. And so he's going to talk about those. I think it's time for me to pull the cork on this, but I'll see you all a week from next Wednesday, and we'll wrap this course up. Okay. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. If you'll come in and have a seat, we'll get started with our devotional. Anthony Wooten's going to be leading us in our singing tonight, leading us in our singing. And Jeff Johnson, one of our shepherds, is going to have our devotional thought. And then we'll be dismissed by Daniel Shipley tonight. Is that right, Daniel? Yeah, good. Okay. We'll be dismissed by Daniel tonight. I wanted to remind you about some folks to keep in your prayers. We've had several folks that have lost loved ones. Of course, we had Stanley's service today. That was a beautiful service. Many of you were there. Thank you for being there and showing your love and support for them. But continue to keep Janelle and their daughter Stephanie and their whole family in your prayers. Also remember the Carlin family. I put that on Light Post that Alan's brother Wade was killed. I believe his legal name is Edwin, but they called him Wade. Remember, he was killed in a car accident on February the 4th. Also, Joey Houston's grandmother, Mrs. Sidney Woodley, passed away January 30th, and they had her service on February the 1st. And Brooke Radcliffe's mother also passed away suddenly this past Sunday, February the 4th. And then also remember the Naylor family, Mitch and Abby. Many of you remember them from here. And of course, you know Mark and Lori, and they are dealing with the loss of their infant daughter. Also, Mara had asked us to be praying for her. She responded Sunday asking that. But we introduced several people on Sunday morning, new members and people who have been baptized recently. So we also have lots to celebrate. Also remember John Adamick as he is at Vanderbilt and starting through that stem cell transplant process. Speaking of Vanderbilt, David Rowland told me, is it next Wednesday you're going? Next Wednesday he's going to be traveling to Vanderbilt. They're going to run some tests, kind of see where things are. So keep him in prayer as well, that they get good news from those. And remember, Wanda Worley has a shoulder surgery coming up next Tuesday, and then Brian Johnson, keep him in prayer as he has a brain surgery coming up in March. There's lots of things to remind you of. Make sure that you're checking Light Post. You're also checking the bulletin that gets emailed out and is also posted on Light Post. A few other things that came up. I'd mentioned Becky Russell today on Light Post. She actually commented that she was able to go home. So she was taken by ambulance, but they released her and she's been able to go back home. There are lots of other folks who have posted asking for prayers for friends and loved ones on Light Post. So make sure you are checking that and keeping those folks in prayer. So that's what I have for you. And again, just make sure you're checking those avenues of information. And I'm going to turn things over to Anthony. Brother.
When morning comes, we'll understand it better by and by. Trials darken every end, and we cannot understand all the ways that God will lead us to that blessed promised land. But He'll guide us with His eye, and we'll follow till we die. We will understand it better by and by. I'm steaming by and by when the morning comes. You know that all the saints of God are gathered home, and we will tell the story how we'll overcome. We will understand it better by and by. All our cherished plans have failed, disappointments have prevailed. I
Before I get started this evening, don't forget the East Tennessee Family Conference that we'll be hosting here next weekend. So next Friday, Saturday, Sunday, making plans for that. It feels like the last several times that I have been to the mailbox, I have seen a lot besides bills. I've seen a lot of tax forms. I don't know about you, maybe you've had that same experience, but I had a lot of tax forms, and of course, taxes are nothing new. There were taxes that had to be paid in the first century, right, when Jesus was walking the earth. And of course, our modern day version of that is the IRS, and I don't know that we usually think of that group too favorably, do when we think of the IRS. Although I'll say that I've got 3 kids, and they've always been pretty generous to me. Maybe it's because I've let them use my money tax-free throughout the year. But as we look at Scripture and we look at tax collectors and what it has to say about tax collectors, really, the times when specific tax collectors are mentioned, it's usually in a positive light. There are 3 that I can think of. Of course, Matthew, the book that bears his name, and the apostle. There is Zacchaeus in Luke chapter 19. And then, of course, in Luke chapter 18, there's the parable that Jesus tells about the Pharisee and the tax collector. And all of those are occasions when Jesus has something positive to say. But tonight I want to look at Matthew and maybe some things that we can learn from Matthew, the tax collector. We don't know a lot about him. Of course, the gospel that bears his name is only mentioned in there a couple of times. And once is whenever Jesus goes to the tax booth and tells him and calls him to be an apostle. The other time is when Matthew is giving us the list of the apostles. But I think that we can learn some things about Matthew the tax collector. To share some with you, 3 quick things with you. First of all, Matthew was someone who invited people to see Jesus. And we see that whenever he was called to be an apostle. Right after Matthew is called by Jesus, we find that Matthew hosts a party. He hosts Jesus in his home. As a matter of fact, Luke's account tells us that Matthew on that occasion invited a great number of people to come and eat with him and to be with Jesus. As we think about our efforts in the Great Commission, I think about what Matthew did here. We can stand on the street corners and we can preach and we can try to strike up a conversation with a complete stranger. There's nothing wrong with that, to be able to share Jesus. But what the example that Matthew gives is by simply reaching out to people that we already know, people with whom we already have a relationship, people that we are similar to, because those are the people that Matthew invited that day. He invited other tax collectors. And so as we think about that, that's something that we can do. And maybe we don't always invite them to the assembly. Maybe we do. But we can invite them to learn more about Jesus in our own home or sharing a meal with them in some way. Something else that I think that we see about Matthew is that Matthew was someone, even as a tax collector, someone who was seeking Jesus. And I say that for a couple different reasons. One, whenever Jesus comes to call Matthew, it says that Jesus comes to the tax booth, to the tax office, and he simply says, "Follow me." And Matthew, he doesn't ask any questions. He requires no explanation. He just simply follows Jesus. I don't know about you, but if it were me, I had some salespeople knock on my door the other night, and they wanted to sell me something, and I was happy to listen. But before I buy anything, what am I going to do? I'm going to ask some questions like, how does this work? Tell me about this. Matthew didn't ask any of those questions. I don't know how it would shake out in the Greek, but I can just imagine him saying, okay. And he did. He went and followed Jesus. Something else that I think that we see as a way of Matthew looking for Jesus. Matthew refers to the Old Testament nearly 100 times in his gospel. That's more than Mark, Luke, and John combined. And so that tells us, I think, that Matthew was a student of the Old Testament, that he knew those scriptures. And yes, I know that he was writing to a different audience. I know that he was inspired by the Spirit. But remember, he was writing with his own pen and perspective. He wasn't just being dictated to. So the fact that Matthew would use the Old Testament the way that he did in his book, I think points to the idea that Matthew was someone who was seeking, he was looking for Jesus. And as we think about that tonight, we have to ask ourselves that same question. Are we looking for Jesus, not just in a philosophical way. You're the ones here on Wednesday night, I understand, but is Jesus someone that we pursue, that he means so much to us that we're gonna spend time in his word, that we'd be able to reflect on it, that it's what we have on our minds and our hearts, it's what we think about. Matthew was somebody who was seeking Jesus. And lastly, Matthew was somebody who was willing to give up a lot to follow Jesus, especially financially. I would suggest that perhaps Matthew probably, at least financially speaking, gave up more than any other apostle financially. You know about tax collectors, and you know how they earned their income, right? They were Jews who were collecting money on behalf of the Romans. And the Romans said, look, you need to pay us this much. We're going to collect this much, and whatever you collect on top of that, you get to keep. And most of the time, tax collectors were pretty wealthy people. Matter of fact, we read about Zacchaeus, says he was a chief tax collector. And so we think about the parable that Jesus told about the laborers in the vineyard, men who would go to the marketplace and hope to get hired just to be able to feed their family that day. I don't think that Matthew was probably too concerned about being able to feed his family. He probably did pretty well. And my guess is that whenever Matthew stepped out of that tax office, probably before the end of the day, his position there was filled. You see, whenever he left that tax office, there was no looking back. There was no 3 days back or your money back guarantee. When he stepped out, that was it. And he committed to following Jesus. And as we think about that, we have to ask ourselves, what are we willing to give up to follow Jesus? Yeah, maybe we give up our lives. Scripture doesn't tell us, but early traditions tell us that Matthew was probably burned at the stake for his faith. And maybe we have to give up our life for Christ sometime. But for most of us, that's not the case. We live in a world and a country where we have those freedoms to be able to express and practice our faith. But what are we willing to give up? I think that Christ wants us to love him, and we do that through our obedience to him. But wrapped up in those things are spending time with him. And so when I ask, what are we willing to give up? I'm asking, are we willing to give up our time for him? And I don't just mean on Sunday mornings and Sunday nights and Wednesday nights and our time inside these four walls. Are we willing to give up our time outside of here? One of the Beatitudes says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And so tonight we think about that. What am I willing to give up? If we love him, and I've heard that the best way to spell love is T-I-M-E. So I've shared a few thoughts with you tonight about Matthew the tax collector, some things that we can learn. One is the way that he drew people to Jesus. He just simply invited people that he already knew, that he already had a relationship with. Matthew was somebody that knew Jesus, that was looking for Jesus, and we see that in the Old Testament, the way that he was able to use that in his book. He was already familiar because whenever Jesus called him, he didn't hesitate. Jesus just said 2 words, follow me, and he did. And Matthew gave up a lot to follow Jesus, and we need to think about what we're willing to give up, especially as it relates to our time. Tonight we offer an invitation, and so perhaps there's someone here tonight that's thinking about some of the things that we've just shared, and maybe you look at someone like Matthew and you say, I don't know that I have been seeking him like I should. I don't know that I have dedicated the time in my life to him and to his church as I should. We're happy to be able to pray for you and with you and be able to help you get back on the right track, to encourage you to be able to give your life and your time to Christ the way that he wants you to. But as well tonight we offer the invitation that Jesus offered Matthew. He said, follow me. Tonight, if you have not followed him, we give you that opportunity to be able to come and submit your life to his and be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, so that you can have the promise of living with him forever in heaven. Will you follow him tonight as we stand and as we sing?
There's not a